Hello, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm Sam Reilly, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion as part of London Art Week's Art History in Focus programme. We're here today to discuss the Black presence in portraiture. And this is a topic which arises at a moment when museums and art historians have increasingly been turning with a renewed focus to depictions of Black subjects over the course of art history, many of which have often previously been overlooked. Over the next hour or so, we'll be taking a broad look across the centuries and asking what it means to retrieve, or in some instances to try and retrieve, the stories and identities of Black sitters in Western paintings, what it reveals about social and cultural history, and also what it might tell us about the genre of portraiture itself. We'll also be looking at what this focus means in the contemporary moment. In recent years, portraits by painters from Africa and its diaspora have increasingly become more visible on a global scale, addressing and redressing historic omissions of representation in Western visual culture. We've got a wonderful panel tonight, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But first of all, I'll just explain how the next hour or so is going to work. To begin with, I've asked each of our speakers to choose a few images which for them really encapsulate this subject. They'll speak on these for a few moments, after which we'll move on to a broader discussion addressing some of the themes and ideas that have been raised. In the final 15 minutes or so, we'll move on to questions from the audience. I'll be monitoring these throughout, so please do write any questions you have for the speakers in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. But first, I'm thrilled to introduce our speakers. Alayo Akinkugbe is the founder of A Black History of Art, an Instagram account begun while Akinkugbe was an art history student at the University of Cambridge in 2020. It now boasts more than 50,000 followers. The aim is to provide a platform for Black artists from all over the world, whether contemporary or historical, whether emerging, famous, or forgotten. Akinkugbe is interested in all periods of art history, but with a view to diversifying the way that art is taught and presented in the West, encouraging a more global and inclusive approach.
Thank you for having me.
Will Elliott established Elliott Fine Art at the beginning of 2020 after working at Sotheby's and Carnegie as director. The gallery focuses on European paintings and drawings from the 19th and early 20th centuries, with the aim both of rediscovering forgotten artists and recontextualizing major names. Elliott's first exhibition with London Art Week this summer was entitled Diverse Beauty, Portraits 1800 to 1950. It offered a sweeping look at the genre across regions, countries, and continents. Michael Ohajuru is a senior fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. He blogs and writes regularly on the Black presence in Renaissance Europe, and has spoken at the National Gallery, Tate Britain, the British Library, National Archives, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. He is the founder of the Image of the Black in London Galleries, a series of gallery tours. And he's the project director and chief evangelist for the John Blank project. John Blank was trumpeter to the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII, and he was the first person of African descent in Britain for whom we have both an image and a record. In his recent body of work, the Ghana-born UK-based painter Arthur Timothy has drawn on family photographs to construct vivid vignettes of post-colonial West Africa, ranging from moments in the lives of relatives to depictions of Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, and his cabinet. Timothy's work has been exhibited at the Royal Academy in London and in a solo show this summer at Gallery 1957 in Accra, among other venues. It is held in important international collections, among them the ICA in Miami. Timothy's architecture and design practice, Timothy Associates, has offices in London and in Bath. Thank you all so much for being here. Alayo, I wondered if you might kick off proceedings with your three images, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, yeah. So I'm starting with this painting by Kehinde Wiley, which I refer to a lot because I think that it kind of explicitly challenges the subordination of the Black figure in kind of like pre-20th century art, and it sort of subverts what we might expect to find in museums, like most national galleries of most European or Western countries. And Reilly takes David's painting of Bonaparte as a point of departure and supplants the figure of Napoleon from David's painting with a contemporary looking Black male figure in this kind of Napoleonic 19th century setting. And he's wearing a bandana and camouflage clothing. And as well as supplanting the white figure of Napoleon with that of a contemporary Black male viewer, he is satirizing the hypermasculinity of portraits like David's, and challenging our notion of who, oh, sorry, I should explain why he's satirizing the hypermasculinity. You can't see it very well in this picture, but even though the background seems kind of kitschy and red and gold and traditional, it's got tiny silver painted sperm cells. So that is a very overt kind of way of satirizing the sort of toxic hypermasculinity of a portrait like that of Napoleon. So yeah, I think that this painting challenges our notion of who is worthy of being immortalized in oil, whose image is worthy of the ornate gilded frame, and who is worthy of occupying 3 by 3 meters of wall space. So I wanted to start with that one. And then the next one is a portrait by Marie-Guillemine Benoit, and it used to be labeled Portrait of a Negress, which I think is something that will probably come into labeling. We'll probably discuss that later. But recently the sitter's name was discovered to be Madeline. So I think it's quite interesting how this, the person in this portrait has gone from being an anonymous sitter labeled only on the basis of her skin color to having an identity thanks to recent research. And I think it's also, with this painting, it's important to consider the relationship between the artist and the sitter, because it was painted in 1800. The sitter probably had no say in the way she was presented, and she's semi-nude. And I think all of these kinds of things are important to think about with this painting, and sort of the power dynamic between the servant and the master, because she's thought to be a servant. I think this was a brief moment in which enslaved people were emancipated, but it was still kind of like her role within society is blurred. So somewhere between a servant and an enslaved person. So, and the next one is this painting by Rossetti. And I mainly want to focus on the figure in the foreground, the Black figure in the foreground, who was a little boy who had a white master. I think he was a servant to this white master, and he cried for hours while he had to pose. And Rossetti wrote about this in a letter, and he talked about how he liked the luster and the shine that the tears gave to the boy's skin and to his complexion. And he also describes the faces and the figures surrounding the bride, who is the central white figure, as jewels. And in relation to the small boy, he wrote, the jet would be invaluable. So this kind of idea that this child is being reduced again just to his skin color, and this idea of objectifying, I think is something we'll probably look into, and using the Black figure as a tool for chiaroscuro, kind of on the peripheries of a painting, enhancing the whiteness of the protagonist, the white bride. And also I just wanted to point out a sitter who was in a lot of pre-Raphaelite paintings is Fanny Eaton, who can be seen kind of in the top right. Her face is, the bottom half of her face is kind of obscured by the protagonist. And she was a mixed race pre-Raphaelite artist model. Yeah, those are the three.
Thanks, Alayo. And certainly we'll come back to ideas of how Reilly is sort of subverting what we expect to find in art history, and also these themes of labeling raised with the Benoit, and also I think certainly the objectification in this Rossetti portrait. But Michael, would you like to introduce your images, please?
I'd just like to explore the history of the Black presence in British portraiture. And I've chosen this one from the Kenwood House. This is an imported image from Europe. But essentially, this image, this image from the 17th century dates back almost a century before to Titian and Renaissance painters who showed elites and signified elite by having a black attendant, an anonymous black attendant, to show the status of the sitter. And as most times, practically all the times, the sitter was anonymous. But when particularly children see these images, they want to know who's that, who they identify, they want to know more about it. And that's causing quite a controversy now. You see in this colonial countryside, the exploitation, the reviews or the examinations of art in the National Trust properties. And they're looking at that relationship between slavery and the National Trust properties. But it's only just children looking at their own images and asking, who is that and why am I there? Do you want to move on to the next slide, please, Sam? In the next slide, this is a typical picture with which children would question the identity. And what's really exciting about this painting is that the black sitter is no longer anonymous. Although in the 1904 inventory, the black sitter was listed as the Negro attendant, the negress attendant. And research now, because people want to know who she is, we found out who she's actually the cousin. She's a cousin of the white sitter. There's a relationship there, but that relationship has been lost. And research now is reconnecting that with that history, and as we understand more about the black sitter. So it gives you the black people, although the children who look at it, some sense of identity, some sense of relationship with the picture. Do you want to move on to the next painting? The next one. This is a really interesting picture. I think reflects how times are changing. This picture was listed for many years as Sir John Chardin. This is a French jewelry maker for the king. And he has a picture of him, and it was listed as just Sir John Chardin. But in January 2021, it was still called Sir John Chardin. That's what painting. But then later that year, it's changed to Sir John Chardin with an unknown male attendant. I think that's really important, because now we're looking at the picture in the round. We're not just looking at the white principal sitter and the black page in attendant supporting him. The black page or the servant has some identity. We'd like to know more, and that's a indicator that the National Portrait Gallery, where this is, want to at least acknowledge him and maybe want to know more. Maybe want to know more about the sitter. And I just want to look at that very carefully here. You've got him looking at very magisterial, authoritative, learned in his library there, pointing to a map of Persia, where he's showing how he traveled the world, and he's got a black attendant with that collar. Now, I want to thank Sam. I want to thank you guys for letting me go to 4 paintings. Now, could you just move on to this last one? This is just astonishing. In the sense that contrast, this was a Renaissance painting. We got the library there to show we're learned, and we've got 2 people sitting there looking quite important, imposing. But what's going on here? This is extraordinary. We've got David Harwood with the Earl of Harwood. The Earl of Harwood owned slaves, and David can trace his several greats back to being owned by Harwood. But here, when you look at this picture, this is very different from the Chardin picture now. We're not talking about someone being subservient, the black figure being marginal. The black figure, in some ways, is almost center. You know, that white shirt and that strong gaze puts him center, and it challenges the position, the black figure in such paintings. When we look at other paintings, you get that contrast. And this is why it really, I want to use the word, it shocked me when I saw it. It was just so powerful, in contrast to other paintings where it's not one of equality, where the black is signifying the strength of the white person. This is completely opposite. It's almost equals. Maybe the black figure is a bit more important, I don't know, but there's a conversation being had here between equals. And so this really, for me, it's a photograph, but it really puts the other paintings into perspective. So thank you for letting me have that 4th one, Sam. Thank you so much.
Quite welcome, Michael, and thank you for that presentation. Certainly these ideas of how research can give us, or how research can sort of undo anonymity and give us a rounder picture of how history was through looking at portraits and analysing them is certainly something that we'll come back and discuss later. Will, would you like to introduce your 2 images, please?
Yes, so I chose the first one primarily because of the remarkable life story of Pierre-Louis Alexandre. And I'll come on to his fascinating life in just a second, but I think it's very important to say, firstly, that this is actually not a portrait. It's an academic study. So it was painted in a life class by a young artist as part of his learning. And unlike a portrait, it doesn't carry any extra pictorial significance. Like some of the images we've just seen, it doesn't carry any moral, political, or social significance. It purports to be nothing more than the direct and straightforward likeness of a handsome black model in an artist's studio. And from the image itself, we have no clues as to the life or the circumstances of the man depicted, and we have no inkling of the artist's attitude towards the model either. So in and of itself, it's quite a neutral object, and I think that's important to bear in mind when looking at it. So the sitter is Pierre-Louis Alexandre, and he was born in French Guiana in either 1843 or 1844, and he was therefore very likely born into slavery, which was not abolished in the French colonies until 1848. And he arrived in Stockholm in 1863, so he would have been 19 or 20, and he arrived in an American ship which was carrying a cargo of pork, and he arrived as a stowaway. And in the late 19th century, the transatlantic crossing in inclement conditions would take 2 to 3 weeks, and in bad weather, up to 2 to 3 months. So I think that gives some indication as to quite how determined and resourceful Pierre-Louis must have been. And his life before arriving in Stockholm, we don't know anything about it, whether he lived in America or whether he merely transited through on his way to Europe, we can't say. But we know that when he arrived in Stockholm, he found work immediately as a dock laborer. But this was seasonal work because in these northern climates, the docks would freeze over in the winter months. And so he, like the other dock workers, had to find another job over the winter months to survive. And for Pierre-Louis Alexandre, this was as a model at the Fine Arts Academy at Stockholm. And he seems to have worked very consistently as a model almost every winter from the mid-70s up until 1903. And he died in 1905 of tuberculosis. So really, the last 24 years of his life, he's doing this consistently. And that means we've got a really remarkable body of work, because as it stands, there's about 40 extant depictions of him. And I'm sure more will come to light in Swedish private collections. And taken as a whole, that's quite an incredible number. I think certainly in the 19th century or even pre-1900, he's probably the black sitter of whom we have the most depictions. There was a black model in France earlier in the century called Joseph, who was famously depicted by Jericho. We have a lot of depictions of him, but I think there's probably a few more of Pierre-Louis Alexandre. So that's quite incredible. And beyond what I said, we don't know much else about his life. We know he married a couple of times and he had children. So he possibly has descendants in Sweden today, though whether they know of his remarkable life and their ancestor, I can't say. And then the next image is something very different. And I chose this because, well, it's just a remarkable painting which stopped me in my tracks the first time I saw it in Copenhagen. But I think it stands in as a good counterpart to the image I've just shown. And that's because it is a portrait, of course, and it's open to a multiplicity of different interpretations. So the lady at center is called Justina Antoine, and she was from the Danish West Indies, and she was the nanny of the 2 children we see. They were the daughters of Otto Marstrand, who was a high-ranking colonial official in the Danish West Indies, and the picture was painted by Wilhelm Marstrand, who was the brother of Otto. And Otto came with Justina and his family to Copenhagen in 1857. There was an outbreak of cholera in the Danish West Indies, so they came there to seek refuge. And whether the portrait was commissioned by the family or whether the artist himself decided to paint it, we don't know. And we also don't know much about Justina's life. Like Pierre-Louis Alexandre, she was probably born into slavery because, again, that wasn't abolished in the Danish West Indies until 1848. But beyond that, we don't know much. But of course, it's remarkable that she's the focal point, she's the center of the composition. And certainly it's the only painting I can think of from this time where there are white sitters and black sitters, and the black sitter is the most important element. There are other examples of black nannies with white children, and the black nannies play important roles, but never the center. So that's something quite incredible. And that may be purely an artistic decision, because Justina is very striking and beautiful, and the two children, let's face it, are a bit plainer. So aesthetically, it makes sense for her to be at the center. And then, like I say, there's many different angles we can look at this portrait. So she wears white and red, which are the colors of the Danish flag. So is that saying she belongs to Denmark, or is it rather saying she's a proud and worthy citizen of Denmark, albeit one without equal rights? And she wears this head garment, which is a traditional item in the Afro-Caribbean community, which was a signifier of individuality and indeed metaphorical freedom during times of slavery, because it stood in counterpart to official slave dress. So we have here a play on identity, perhaps. Is she Danish? Is she Afro-Caribbean? Is she both? And then you have the two children who hold her. Are they holding her out of affection, out of a need for reassurance from their beloved Nanny? Or are they rather holding her in place in her position in society, and are they holding her in place in terms of her national affiliation? So perhaps I'm over-interpreting, but I think certainly there are all these elements at play that make it quite a fascinating and to my mind, a unique picture from the 19th century.
Thanks very much. Well, there's some very interesting sort of thoughts there. I suppose art is a means of recovering biography and of recovering and meditating on identity, which I think leads rather nicely into Arthur's images.
Thank you. The first image I've chosen is a painting by Velázquez, which is of Juan de Pareja. And he was actually Velázquez's slave. That came as a surprise to me when I discovered that, because to me in this picture, he seems very, very proud, noble, and very confident. And I understand that the painting was done in 1650. At the time, Velázquez and Juan de Pareja had actually traveled to Rome. And Velázquez was doing the commission for Pope Innocent X. And because he had a limited period in which to do this painting, he practiced by painting his slave, assistant, manservant, whatever you think. But I love this painting. To me, I think it's just an incredible portrayal of a very confident black man. At the time, I understand that it received huge public approval when it was displayed, and also I believe it is the first painting, or first Spanish painting of a black sitter who was named, so we know his identity. Also, I find it interesting because apparently he was a painter in his own right. He gained his freedom, I think, some 4 years later, and he went on to do a number of paintings, one of which is in the Prado, and it's a painting of St. Matthew, which was a very large painting, and he inserted himself in the corner of that painting. If we could move on to the next picture, I have to say that these pictures were inserted at Sam's suggestion. This is one of my paintings. It is a painting of my two brothers and myself. We were in Sierra Leone at the time, and I tried to, the photograph on which it was based was a very simple photograph with a plain wall in the background, but I tried to look at it by representing the scenery of Sierra Leone in the background, and with the vegetation and the fruit and so on. And really, I was looking at the idea of dealing with young adolescents, that sort of transition from innocence to the sort of teenage years. And there's a kind of awkwardness which I hope to portray with this. Moving on to the next painting. Again, this is a painting of myself and my two brothers. My brother Desmond is on the right, Franklin is in the middle, and I'm the one on the left with the ill-fitting clothes. And in this picture, we had been dragged, it was after a church service, and we had to go to have our photographs taken, and we were very reluctant. And again, I was playing with the awkwardness that we felt at the time of having to sit and sort of be quiet whilst these photographs were taken. The style of the photograph, I mean, there are many black and white photographs of the time which were taken in these small photographic studios, which were very common, I think, throughout West Africa. So yeah, that's how I did that one. And if we could move on to the next picture. Again, this is myself, my brother Franklin, and an elder cousin called Valerie. Very similar, taken at the same sort of time. And in a way, I think perhaps the issue of identity was kind of in the back of my mind, because I came to the UK in 1966 at the age of 9, and I've been here sort of ever since, although I went back every year for holidays. So it's in a way reflecting back on these childhood years. Yeah, I think that is my last image, Sam. Oh, sorry, forgive me, there's one more. This is of my late grandmother, Harriet. Again, she was a very strong woman. She ran a bakery, and she brought my father up on her own because my father died when he was very young. And she was able to send him to study in England, I think in the early 40s, which at that time was quite a big thing for a single mother to do. She sent him over, and he came over to study dentistry. And because she had made such a sacrifice to get him here, my father decided that he wanted to study journalism. So he changed courses, and he didn't tell her until he had actually started working as a journalist. Didn't want to disappoint her. But I hope that this painting captures something of her strength. It was done in her old age, and I think perhaps she is much more fragile at this stage. But she was a very special lady. That's the last of my images.
Thank you so much for sharing them, Arthur. It's, they're fabulous images, and they encourage reflection on portraiture and contemporary portraiture, as I suppose, as you said, as a vehicle for exploring identity, and for sort of exploring one's past identity as well. We're going to move on to sort of discussing some of the themes that have been raised there, and I think identity is a good place to start. It draws us back, Alayo, to the Benoit painting, and this question of, I wanted to ask, how does knowing the identity of a subject, where previously perhaps we haven't, in what ways does it change the way that we interpret a portrait or how we look at it?
So is that directed to me?
Yes.
Yeah, I do actually have some notes on this. So I was thinking about identity and how it's a bit of a loaded word, but I think when we're talking about the name of a sitter, I think that we're talking about the name of the sitter and having some information about their biography, etc. I think it totally changes the way a portrait is interpreted, because suddenly you know a lot more about what the dynamic between the sitter and the artist is. And I think it's especially useful when looking at the Black figure. So many, like with the Marie-Guillemine Benoit painting, many of those paintings of Black sitters from the pre-20th century refer to them like as Black man or woman, or as negress or Negro. So I think we begin to understand more about who they were and why they've been presented in this way in a portrait when we know their name or something about their life. Obviously, in most cases, it's that they're in an inferior relation to the artist, maybe their servant, maybe they're painting them because they've never painted a Black figure before, they like their appearance or it seems exotic. Yeah, I think that it does give us more information about the sitter, especially as we're talking about portraiture, which is so much to do with identity. Yeah.
Does the Rossetti perhaps sort of trouble that, though? I mean, this is an instance where, you know, we know the sitter, but but there are still sort of problematic issues that arise from what we know of the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, with the Rossetti, there's the little boy who we don't actually know. I don't think we know the name of him, but we know that he was the servant of one of Rossetti's friends. And I think just having only that information is kind of, yeah, it does disrupt this idea of having, having the identity of the figure. But Fanny Eaton is very well known and was even on a Google art thing in the past few years. A lot of research has been done into her. And I think that knowing more about her, and that she worked partly as a pre-Raphaelite model and also as a maid, sort of, I don't know, she goes from being an anonymous Black sitter to someone who we know about their life. People have been able to trace her descendants and all of that kind of thing. It just gives them more of an identity and moves away from this objectification, which you have with the younger boy in the Rossetti painting.
For sure, we'll come back to the relationship between sort of artist and sitter in a moment. But Michael, with the Scone Palace painting, you mentioned that there's been sort of, by identifying the sitters, we're actually able to uncover something about the relationship of the people within the portrait. I wonder if what Alayo said about knowing identity chimes with your thoughts on that.
With them, very much so, because it's all about value in terms of the artist, the patron valued that person enough to actually give him a name, give him or her a name, and that, so then we as a viewer, particularly as a Black viewer, to know that is somebody, not just anyone, not just an anonymous person, but someone that we recognize with. I remember my mum used to say, "It's good to see your face." And it's good to see your face, but it's even better to know the face that you're looking at. And that's why it's so precious. And particularly with that painting by John Martin, I think, where you've got what it was originally called the Negress Attendant. And that assumes that this is, and then like all of going back to Titian's, the Dana and Chianti, where the black is just a peripheral figure. It's just an attendant. Move on, nothing going on here. But she's more important, and that's what it's about. Black people have some agency, some power in life, and giving them a name, an identity, a backstory, gives them, and also the viewer, Black viewers, some sense of, well, we're here, we're part of it, whatever it is.
Absolutely, Arthur, that sounds like it rather chimes with your experience looking at the Velázquez and sort of realizing who Pareja was and finding out sort of about his own paintings as well.
Exactly. Sorry, I was going to go back. No, sorry, Arthur.
No, go ahead. It's fine. Yes, I mean, I was very pleased to discover that he was a painter in his own right, and to look at some of his paintings. You know, I was just very impressed with the way that he was painted, because to me, he the way he was painted, he could have been an aristocrat, and you'd not have known that. So it made a big impression.
Let's move on to sort of thinking about the question of this relationship between the artist and the subject. Well, the Nils Larsen painting, I find it very interesting that you sort of introduced it by describing it as a formal study, and it reminded me perhaps as a point of contrast with the Rossetti. But you mentioned too that the fact that we have 40 depictions or so of Pierre-Louis Alexandre gives us an opportunity, I suppose, to recreate a biography where otherwise we might not.
Yes. Well, I think he's a slightly unique case in that, as I say, there are no depictions of him which aren't outside of the parameters of an academic training ground for young artists. We don't have a portrait of him showing him in terms of his own individuality, who he is. So that's a very good point. And also I'd say the Nils Larsen picture shows him just wearing a simple yellow cloth, but there are other depictions of him where you see him dressed in Middle Eastern garb with a scimitar and a turban. So I think, again, there's this idea of exoticism, and because he's black, he's been exoticized and turned into a Middle Easterner, which of course is, which has nothing to do with his personality or where he's from or his life story. So I think, even though, as I said, this is the image we've looked at is more of a neutral academic study, in other depictions of him, it's not neutral. And of course, he was paid to be there, but he had no say in how he was depicted. And of course, I think that's a point which can be applied more broadly to all these portraits. The sitters are black, but the artists are white, and the patrons are white. And so the black sitter often has no say in how they are represented. It's the white patron and the white artist who decide. And of course, it's also a white audience. These were not painted for a black audience. They were painted for a white audience. So I think when we look at these images, as striking and as beautiful as they can be, images of great artistic merit, we can't ever forget this context within which they were created. And also there is this imbalance between the relationship of the black sitter and the white artist.
Certainly, which makes me think immediately, Michael, of the Harewood photograph and the word patronage and the way that sort of flipped on its head. Is that what you feel when you look at that photo?
Exactly, because it was bought. It's an imported photograph, an imported image, which was copied. The idea of the white elite supported by the black anonymous servant. It's just replicating an idea that went on for centuries, and it's only now that we're trying to recover some of those figures. Many have been lost, but some can be recovered and give them some sense of identity. And then in some way we make a connection with them. They're not just anonymous supporters of the white figure. So I think, for me, that's very important. To actually recover the identity where we can.
Absolutely, and it leads very nicely into this question of how the sort of scholarly effort to recover identities of the past leads into and informs a contemporary moment. Arthur, I wonder if you might have thoughts on I suppose the connections between this area of study and perhaps how you go about your work.
Sure. I'm not a historian, but I think that it's very interesting. I've sort of looked at the work that Michael has been doing, and I'm sort of fascinated by it because the way in which I think Black people have actually been sort of wiped out from history, and very important. representations of events and so on, is really quite shocking. I know of the paintings of the Queen of Sheba and so forth, who was actually supposed to have been from Ethiopia, who's often depicted as white in European paintings. And I mean, there are many cases like this. I sort of feel that the historical, I mean, the main thing, it really seems to me, it's about power and how that power has been sort of translated, and sort of it has eradicated Black people from this representation. However, I discovered that there are some paintings, I think there's some Dutch paintings, which show Black ambassadors, I think in the 15th, 16th century, who visited Holland, and they had their official portraits painted. They paid for these portraits themselves, and they were very, very wealthy individuals, and they had with them their own Black servants. And I think that there are some images, but not very many images, where this happens. I think it's really important that what historical research is showing now is that you know, we are finding out things like the presence of Black people in Tudor times in the UK. We also have confirmation of a number of, well, a lot of Black people who are actually resident here in Roman times, huge Black populations in France, you know, very, very early stages. So I think the historical research is really good and very, very important in sort of informing this narrative. I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but
it's no, it certainly has, and it's raised others. I think that's right. There's been a lot of good writing and research and exhibitions in this area in the last 5 years. But I was interested also by this word power, and, you know, the recovery of power and the translation of power into art. Alayo, it really reminded me of Wiley's take on David, which is sort of doing the same thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's so striking about the Wiley is that it's kind of like, we're so used to seeing these kind of romantic neoclassical style paintings with occasionally a Black figure in a corner or in the background, or serving a white figure, as we saw in many of the images. But he just completely supplants that. And it's clear that he's sort of making a comment on sort of maybe the role of the Black figure moving forward, or how Black people can be presented moving forward. What I think is very interesting is that work hangs in the Brooklyn Museum. And I think that if I was a young child living in Brooklyn and I had seen an image like that growing up in a sort of big institution that shows all these great masterworks, it would have probably changed my relationship with art and with my identity as a Black person. So yeah, I think I find that painting very striking.
For sure, and I mean, it's a wonderful image, and it certainly it raises a question which I was interested in, because of the way that it sort of works of and through the David painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps, and in the sense, and the paintings that we've largely been discussing have really kind of used the genre, or, you know, the genre of portraiture as it's been sort of codified within the West. But I wondered, you know, in what ways, specifically thinking about sort of contemporary practice, you know, how important is it to bear in mind traditions of portraiture that have grown up outside Europe? You know, portrait sculptures, masks in Africa, etc. I think, Will, I wonder if you had some.
Well, I think it's very important. I don't, obviously it's not necessarily related, but I think all art forms are equally important and carry equal weight from every corner of the globe. So I'm not an artist myself. I'm sure Arthur can speak more to the point, but I think it's incredibly important that these things have the same platform. But on that topic, I did actually want to say something which I've recently discovered myself, which I find fascinating. That's the idea of a Black presence in portraiture outside of both Africa and Europe. So I'm thinking specifically of the Indian subcontinent. And there's a Black community or African descended community there still today called the Sidi. And they arrived in India from the 7th, 8th century onwards from East Africa, either as slaves or sometimes as traders. And they formed a small but certainly not negligible community. And in the Mughal period, for example, you have some Mughal miniatures which depict some of these Sidi, and they're quite remarkable things. And there's one figure in particular called Malik Ambar, who was from Ethiopia, and he was the prime minister, in fact, the de facto ruler of a state called Ahmednagar in central India. And he was militarily very powerful. He defeated the Mughals in battle and was a constant thorn in their side. And so during his lifetime, which is the late 16th, early 17th century, you see his likeness quite frequently in some of these Mughal miniature manuscripts. And when I found out about this, I just thought it was incredible. And I suppose it's less well known in Europe than some of the pictures we've been talking about. But I think it's, these things in India are equally deserving of attention and understanding. So yeah, I think it's fascinating to think about a Black presence outside of both Africa and Europe.
No, certainly. I want Michael. Do you look beyond Europe in these ways in your research?
Deep breath. Will, those CD in India, they've got a very troubled and challenging history. Very troubled in terms of their relationship with the bigger community, and it's very much like in Europe, where they're marginal. In their day, they're marginal, and today they're ostracized people, very much ostracized. In terms of the Black presence outside Europe, my passion is the fact that Europe took itself into Africa, into China, and it took Black people with them, because there's pictures of the Portuguese in Benin. And the Benin, I was going to say photographed them. They took images of them. So in the Benin bronzes, you can see Portuguese people, or equally you can see the Portuguese in Naban art, but they got Black people with them. So you've got Japanese 17th century paintings or murals of Portuguese ships or Portuguese traders, but they include their Black attendants. And that to me is that's where I find appealing, the fact that there's been a symbiotic relationship to Africa and Europe. It's not us and them. It's not either. They've been together. And when you look at paintings from China and around the world, and these various the Congo Empire, the Benin Empire, we can see that the white presence, translated by Black people. That's what I find so interesting. Not so much often portraiture, because the portraiture is a European thing, but the way the Africans assimilate the European into their art. Like I'm thinking, as I mentioned, you mentioned Benin art, in the Congo art, you can see in their religious art where they've incorporated European ideas. That's what I'm interested in, just to show that we were there and there was a connection. That it wasn't just us and them. They were related. There was a connection.
No, absolutely. And Arthur, there's this idea of sort of a shared history between Africa and Europe. Kind of, how does it inform your painting?
It's something that I am very aware of, and I try to sort of communicate in the paintings that I do. But it's something also, though, that and I'm very much aware of the sort of history of Sierra Leone, because I'm half Ghanaian and half Sierra Leonean, so I actually did a lot of research on the history of Sierra Leone, and it's fascinating because one of the paintings that was featured, I think it was one of Michael's paintings, the one of Dido and her cousin. Now, in that painting, I found out that yes, Dido was the cousin of the white lady, but they were living with Lord Mansfield, and Lord Mansfield was a famous judge who presided over, although he was an abolitionist later on, but he was a judge who presided over the cases that Granville Sharp brought forward against slavers who were capturing freed slaves and taking them back forcibly. And there's this very interesting connection sort of going on. And in that particular painting, it seems as if the way that Dido is portrayed, holding the fruit, is similar to the way a lot of Black people were portrayed in subservient roles. But it's done in such a way that it looks as if they're equals. However, it could also be interpreted that that they, perhaps the family was embarrassed or whatever, but perhaps some people, perhaps white people, could interpret that painting as if Dido was actually a servant, and for others, it would appear as if they were equals. So I find that very interesting. But going back to the main thing you mentioned about the sort of different aspects of being here and being from Africa as well, it is a constant. It's a constant thing that I try to work with, and I'm not sure if there's any resolution to it, but and also I'm not sure how it comes out, but it's always present.
Certainly. Thanks. Thoughts on Dido are wonderful, Arthur. I think there's this sense of the power of art and how we can look in different ways and retrieve different stories. It's just exactly what we've been talking about. We're going to move on to some questions from the audience now. And there's this very interesting one here, which I wonder if it's one particularly for Alayo. But an anonymous attendee asked, how difficult was it for the speakers to select the particular works discussed in terms of research and accessibility? I know, Alayo, that the Benoit was one of the very earliest ones you had on your Instagram account, right? So maybe, how did you come across it?
Well, so I picked the Benoit because it's something that I've been thinking about since school, and it was kind of my initiation into actually enjoying, well, I enjoyed art history, but to feeling some kind of personal connection was researching that painting for a project. And since I've left school, so I think I did that in 2017, since I've left school, so much research has been done on the sitter, and at the time there was no name, it was just a portrait of a negress. And I didn't really know how art history worked. I didn't know what kind of research was considered good or bad, but I was looking into all of these themes of like, did she know how she was, did she get to control how she was presented? What does it mean that we don't have her name and all of this kind of thing? So I think seeing that work have so much research done since 2017 has been amazing. And then it was also the first painting that I posted on a Black history of art, because I had seen this kind of change, and also it was the thing that led me to start enjoying art history and choose to study it at university. And the Wiley, just because, as I said, it's so striking, and the Rossetti, because I thought it was very interesting the way he conceives of this figure as a jewel rather than a person, and the fact that the boy's tears were seen as something, like, he thought of it as a very aesthetic project. He didn't really see the figure as a person, in my opinion.
For sure. I suppose you and Michael both have really been working to improve the accessibility of the research that is possible. I mean, Michael, how difficult, do you have a remark on the difficulty of uncovering your material?
Deep breath. On the one hand, it's very easy because there's a lot being done on that right now. It's almost fashionable. There's a lot going on. Sadly, the ones you really want to know about, there's so little to go on. It's hard to get information. So you have to tease it together from other pieces. Like my own big man, John Blank. We've got 2 images of him and 7 brief lines in the court records. how can we recover an image, an idea of a person from that? So that's part of the fun, not the way of fun, of kind of reimagining these characters, these figures, and bringing them to life and giving them some sense of humanity, so a presence. So in some ways, it's a challenge and it's fun, and it's kind of almost like piecing together, you know, the ideas of people. So no, I think it's I think this is a very great time to be in this subject, because people are keen to understand paintings as a time capsule. So when you look at that painting, you can unpick it, you can unpack what was going on at that time in the artist's life, in the sitter's life, in the patron's life. You can pick all that out, and the Black presence helps you understand that, helps you understand more about the paintings. So no, it's challenging, but it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
For sure. We have a question from Kathy Leneker. This is one for the art historians. Any thoughts on the work of Glyn Philpott and his pictures and sculptures of Henry Thomas? I think raise your hand.
I did write about this a bit for an article, which was over a year ago now. But I think Henry Thomas was a servant to Glyn Philpott and also his muse. And I think, again, the important thing to consider is the relation between the artist and the sitter, and how much agency Henry Thomas had in the way he was depicted. And there are some very exoticizing images of him, and then there are also some that seem almost equal to his paintings of white counterparts. But I can't say much about this. I did write an article on it, and it's on Art UK if anyone wants to read that.
It's a very good article. Will, do you start chime with your understanding?
Well, I may well be wrong. If so, feel free to correct me. But I think they were lovers. I think that was the case. And if that is the case, if I am right, then obviously that opens up a very interesting angle as to the depiction and the balance between black model and white artist, and also sort of on that topic, Duncan Grant of that era, 20s, 30s, he was a gay white artist, but he had some black lovers as well who he depicted, and I don't know much about the subject, but again, that sort of reminds me of that, and that's perhaps something also quite interesting to think about and look into.
Sure. We've just in the closing seconds, but I believe this is a quick one for Arthur, but Barbara Hull asks, she says, I would like to think that Grandma Harriet would not have been too disappointed by her son's change of career.
No, actually, no, she wasn't disappointed. She was pleased. She was pleased because he was doing well. I mean, it would have been a disaster if it hadn't worked out, I think. But yeah, no, she was very proud.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're coming to the end of our hour, which I've enjoyed hugely, and I hope you have. I've learned a lot, and I think that there's been something affirming to come out of this, I suppose, about the power of looking at art in different ways, in ways that aren't the same tired old ways, and the kinds of new stories that can yield. So I just want to extend thanks to London Art Week for hosting. There are a couple of other events in the Art History in Focus programme. Tomorrow evening, we have Late Sickert, so the late paintings of Walter Sickert. And I believe the following evening, there will be an exploration of the use of precious stones in art history and architecture. So you can go to www.londonartweek.co.uk for more information. Which leaves me just to thank our speakers tremendously a final time. Thank you very, very much for your time and your expertise and your insights. And thank you very much to all of you for joining us. Good night.